Working the night shift at the gas station wasn't exactly the job of my dreams, but it paid the bills. The station sat on the outskirts of a small, forgotten town in eastern America, surrounded by dense woods and an endless stretch of highway. Most nights were the same, silent and uneventful, with only the occasional semi-truck or lost traveler stopping by. That night started like any other. The hum of the fluorescent lights above the counter was the only sound in the station. I sat on the stool behind the counter, scrolling through my phone, trying to stay awake. Outside, the parking lot was empty, illuminated by a single flickering street lamp. The shadows it cast danced on the cracked pavement, but I was used to the eerie stillness. Then, around 1 a.m., the bell above the door chimed. I looked up, expecting to see a trucker or maybe one of the regulars who popped in for coffee. But it wasn't anyone I recognized. The man who walked in looked off. He was tall and thin, his face pale and drawn, with dark circles under his eyes. He wore a tattered coat that looked 2 sizes too big, and his hands were shoved deep into his pockets. He didn't say anything at first, just glanced around the store like he was looking for something, or someone. "Evening," I said, forcing a smile. He didn't respond. Instead, he walked to the back of the store, his movements stiff and jerky, and started browsing the shelves. Something about him set me on edge. He didn't look like the kind of guy who'd be out shopping at 1 a.m. I kept an eye on him as he moved through the aisles, his head snapping toward the door every time the wind rattled it. Finally, he grabbed a pack of gum and walked to the counter. "That all for you tonight?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. He nodded, sliding the gum across the counter without meeting my eyes. As I rang him up, I noticed his hands were trembling. "You okay?" I asked, handing him his change. "Fine," he muttered, his voice barely audible. But his hands kept shaking as he stuffed the gum into his pocket. Then he leaned in, his eyes darting toward the door. "Have you seen anyone else around tonight?" he asked. "No," I said slowly. "It's been pretty quiet." He nodded, his jaw tightening. "Good. That's good." Before I could ask what he meant, he turned and walked out the door, disappearing into the darkness. I watched him go, my gut telling me something wasn't right. And then I saw it. A dark stain on the counter where his hand had been. It wasn't much, just a few drops, but when I leaned closer, my stomach twisted. It was blood. I grabbed a paper towel and wiped the counter clean, trying to shake the uneasy feeling settling over me. It wasn't unusual to get strange customers out here. Truckers, drifters, people passing through. But something about this guy felt different. I stepped outside, the cold night air biting at my skin, and glanced around the parking lot. The man was gone, but something caught my eye near the edge of the lot. A faint glint of metal in the moonlight. I walked over, my curiosity outweighing my better judgment. Lying in the dirt was a small, bloodied knife. I stared at it, my mind racing. Had the man dropped it? Was it his blood? Or someone else's? The distant sound of a car engine snapped me out of my thoughts. Headlights appeared on the horizon, growing brighter as the vehicle approached. I tucked the knife into my pocket and hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. The car pulled into the lot a few moments later, an old sedan with rusted doors and a cracked windshield. I watched from behind the counter as 2 men got out, both dressed in dark clothes. They didn't come inside right away. Instead, they stood by the car, talking in hushed voices and glancing toward the gas station. My heart started to race. I had a bad feeling about this. Finally, one of them walked to the door and pushed it open. The bell chimed, but the sound felt louder, sharper than usual. "Evening," the man said, his voice smooth but cold. He was older than the first guy, mid-40s maybe, with a thick beard and piercing blue eyes. "Evening," I replied, forcing a smile. He leaned on the counter, his eyes scanning the store. "We're looking for someone," he said, his tone casual. "A guy in a long coat, tall, skinny. You seen him?" I hesitated, my mind flashing to the blood on the counter and the knife in my pocket. "Can't say I have," I lied, trying to keep my voice steady. The man studied me for a moment, his eyes narrowing. "You sure about that?" "Yeah," I said quickly. It's been quiet all night. His lips curled into a thin smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. All right, he said, straightening up. Let me know if he shows up. He turned and walked out, the bell chiming behind him. I watched as he and his partner got back in the car and drove off, their headlights disappearing into the darkness. But the uneasy feeling in my stomach didn't go away. Something told me this night was far from over. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the bloodied knife. Whatever was going on, I was now a part of it. The bloodied knife in my pocket felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried the weight of something far worse than its size implied. I couldn't stop thinking about the man, the fear in his voice, the shaking in his hands. And then those two men, their cold stares and veiled threats. Something was happening, and I was right in the middle of it. The parking lot was empty again, the hum of the fluorescent lights outside the station the only sound. I tried to calm my nerves by wiping down the counter, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were faint but unmistakable dark smudges on the tiled floor, leading from the door to the counter and then back out again. I crouched down, squinting at the marks. It wasn't just dirt. It was blood. The man had been bleeding more than I realized. I followed the trail to the door, my heart pounding. It continued outside, faint drops leading across the parking lot and toward the woods that bordered the station. For a moment, I just stared into the dark trees, debating whether to follow it. Then, against every ounce of common sense I had, I grabbed a flashlight from behind the counter and stepped outside. The cold air bit at my skin as I crossed the lot, the flashlight beam bouncing with my unsteady movements. The blood trail was harder to see now, but it was still there, leading into the woods. I hesitated at the tree line, my instincts screaming at me to turn back. But I couldn't. I needed to know what was going on. The woods were silent, the kind of quiet that pressed against your ears and made your own breathing sound deafening. The flashlight's beam danced over tree trunks and underbrush, searching for any sign of movement. Then I saw it. A smudge of red on the bark of a tree, like someone had pressed a bloody hand against it. The trail was fresh. I moved deeper into the woods, my heart racing. After a few minutes, the trail ended at a small clearing. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just the same tangled undergrowth and scattered leaves. But then my flashlight landed on something that made my stomach twist. A jacket. It was crumpled on the ground, dark with blood, and next to it was a single worn boot. I crouched down, my fingers brushing against the fabric. It was the same jacket the man from earlier had been wearing. But he wasn't here. The sound of a twig snapping behind me made me freeze. I turned slowly, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing. The woods were still, but the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I wasn't alone. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, straining to hear any sound, any movement. Then faintly I heard it, a low, wet gurgling sound. It was coming from deeper in the woods. I gripped the flashlight tighter, my pulse pounding in my ears as I followed the sound. The beam of light landed on a tree, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. Carved into the bark was a single word: run. The gurgling sound grew louder, and I turned the flashlight toward it. That's when I saw him, the man from earlier, slumped against a tree, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. His coat and shirt were soaked with blood, and his chest rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths. But his eyes were still open, wide with terror. "Help me," he rasped, his voice barely audible. I dropped to my knees beside him, my flashlight trembling in my hand. "What happened?" I asked, my voice shaking. "They're coming," he whispered, his bloodied hand clutching my sleeve. "Who?" He opened his mouth to answer, but before he could speak, his body went rigid. A wet, choking sound escaped his throat, and his eyes rolled back into his head. I stumbled backward, my flashlight beam catching the blood pooling around him. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and getting closer. I scrambled to my feet, my breath catching in my throat as I spun around, searching the darkness. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a low, guttural laugh that sent shivers down my spine. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. No response. The laugh came again, closer this time, and I felt the weight of unseen eyes watching me. I didn't wait to find out who or what was out there. I turned and ran, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I tore through the trees. Branches scratched at my face and arms, the cold air burning in my lungs. Behind me, the laughter grew louder, echoing through the woods. When I burst out of the trees and into the gas station parking lot, I didn't stop. I ran inside, locking the door behind me and grabbing the phone to call the police. The line was dead. I sank to the floor, gasping for breath, my mind racing. Whatever was happening, it wasn't over. And then, through the glass door, I saw them. 2 figures, standing at the edge of the lot, their faces hidden in shadow. The figures at the edge of the lot didn't move. They just stood there, silhouetted against the faint glow of the street lamp, their faces obscured by shadow. My breath hitched as I crouched behind the counter, gripping the knife I'd grabbed from the kitchen earlier. The fluorescent lights inside the station flickered, casting the room in a sickly, wavering glow. "Go away," I whispered under my breath, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. But they didn't go away. One of them stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. As he came closer, the light caught his face, and I felt my stomach turn. It was the shorter man from the car earlier, but his face was wrong. His eyes were wild, bloodshot, and his mouth was twisted into a wide grin. His teeth yellowed and crooked. There was blood smeared across his cheek, and his hands were stained red, the color stark against his pale skin. He reached the glass door and pressed his face against it, his eyes scanning the room like an animal sizing up its prey. "Let me in," he said, his voice muffled but still unervingly clear. I shook my head, backing away from the counter. The taller man appeared behind him, his expression calm and cold, like he was enjoying the show. "Don't be rude," he said, his voice smooth and mocking. "Open the door." I gripped the knife tighter, my hands slick with sweat. "Get out of here," I shouted, my voice shaking. The shorter man laughed, the sound high-pitched and grating. "You're not scared, are you?" he asked, his grin widening. The taller man placed a hand on his shoulder, pulling him back slightly. "Not yet," he said softly, his gaze locking onto mine through the glass. Then, without warning, the shorter man swung something heavy at the door. A tire iron, the metal crashing against the glass with a deafening crack. I stumbled backward, my pulse racing as the glass spiderwebbed but didn't break. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice cracking. But they didn't stop. The shorter man swung the tire iron again, the glass splintering further with each hit. I turned and ran to the back room, slamming the door shut and shoving a shelf against it. The sound of breaking glass rang out from the front, followed by the heavy thud of boots on the tiled floor. "Where are you?" the shorter man sang, his voice echoing through the station. Come out, wherever you are." I pressed myself against the wall, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Through the thin door, I could hear their footsteps moving through the store, the sound of items being knocked over and shelves being overturned. "Check the back," the taller man said, his voice steady and commanding. I scanned the room, looking for anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes landed on a metal crowbar leaning against the wall, and I grabbed it, my hands trembling. The door rattled as the shorter man tried the handle, laughing softly when he found it locked. "You can't hide forever," he said, his voice muffled but taunting. The door shook harder as he started kicking it, each impact making my heart jump. The shelf I'd pushed against the door held for a while, but with one final kick, the door burst open, sending the shelf crashing to the floor. The shorter man stepped inside, his grin even wider now, the tire iron swinging lazily in his hand. "There you are," he said, his eyes gleaming with excitement. I didn't wait for him to make the first move. I swung the crowbar with everything I had, the metal connecting with his shoulder with a sickening crack. He let out a howl of pain, stumbling backward, but his grin never faltered. "Feisty," he said, his voice strained. The taller man appeared in the doorway, his expression darkening as he took in the scene. "Enough," he said, his voice cold. Before I could react, he lunged at me, grabbing the crowbar and wrenching it from my hands with terrifying strength. I stumbled backward, tripping over the fallen shelf and landing hard on the floor. The shorter man crouched beside me, his face inches from mine. "You're gonna regret that," he whispered, his breath hot and foul. He grabbed my arm, his grip like a vice, and pulled me to my feet. "Let's show him what happens to troublemakers," he said, turning to the taller man. The taller man nodded, his eyes cold and calculating. "Take him to the woods," he said. Panic surged through me as they dragged me toward the broken door, their grips unrelenting. The cold night air hit me like a slap to the face as they pulled me across the lot and into the trees. I struggled, kicking and twisting, but they were too strong. The shorter man laughed, clearly enjoying my fear, while the taller man stayed silent, his focus unbroken. They dragged me deeper into the woods, the darkness swallowing us whole. Finally, they stopped in a small clearing, the moonlight casting eerie shadows on the ground. "This is where it ends," the taller man said, his voice devoid of emotion. The shorter man raised the tire iron, his grin widening. I braced myself, my mind racing for a way out. Then, in the distance, I heard it, the faint wail of a siren. The taller man's head snapped toward the sound, his calm demeanor faltering for the first time. "They're coming," he said, his voice low. The shorter man hesitated, his grip on the tire iron tightening. "Finish it," the taller man commanded. But before he could, the sirens grew louder, the sound cutting through the night like a beacon of hope. Red and blue lights flickered through the trees, and the shorter man cursed under his breath. "This isn't over," he hissed, releasing me and disappearing into the shadows. The taller man followed, his movements swift and deliberate. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath as the lights grew closer. Moments later, a police officer appeared, his flashlight beam landing on me. "Are you hurt?" he asked, crouching beside me. "They're out there," I managed to say, my voice trembling. "We know," he said, his jaw tightening. "They won't get far." As the officers helped me to my feet, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Somewhere out there, they were waiting for their next chance. The officer's flashlight flickered as he helped me to my feet, his grip steady but urgent. "Are you sure you're okay?" he asked, his voice low but firm. I nodded shakily, my body still trembling from the sheer terror of what had just happened. "They went that way," I said, pointing toward the direction the two men had disappeared. The officer nodded, gesturing to the others. "Fan out. Search the area. They couldn't have gone far." The woods were soon alive with the sound of crunching leaves, barking dogs, and the faint hum of radios crackling as officers coordinated their search. I stayed near the edge of the woods, leaning against a patrol car, my mind racing. The paramedics arrived not long after, their questions blurring together as they checked me over for injuries. "Just scratches," I mumbled, though I wasn't sure if I was trying to convince them or myself. But the real damage wasn't physical. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, the wild, bloodshot eyes of the shorter man, the cold, calculating stare of the taller one. And that laughter, it echoed in my head, a cruel reminder that they were still out there, somewhere in the darkness. Hours passed, and the officers returned from the woods one by one, their expressions grim. "We didn't find them," one of them said, shaking his head. The detective leading the operation frowned, his jaw tightening. "They couldn't have just vanished," he muttered. "They know these woods," I said quietly, my voice barely audible. "They're not normal. They're hunting." The detective's gaze softened, and he placed a hand on my shoulder. "We'll find them," he said, though his tone betrayed a hint of doubt. The next day, news of the attack spread through the town like wildfire. The gas station was cordoned off with yellow tape, its shattered windows and overturned shelves a grim testament to the night's events. The media descended on Colton, reporters swarming the streets, their cameras flashing as they interviewed anyone willing to talk. But no one had answers. The police worked around the clock, setting up roadblocks and combing the woods, but the two men were nowhere to be found. It was as if they'd disappeared into thin air. I tried to go back to my life, but things were different now. The nights felt darker, the shadows deeper. Every knock on the door, every creak of the floorboards made my heart race. Couldn't sleep. Instead, I found myself staring out the window, watching the street below, half expecting to see them standing there, waiting. A week after the attack, I received an envelope in the mail. There was no return address, just my name scrawled on the front in shaky handwriting. My stomach twisted as I opened it, my hands trembling. Inside was a single Polaroid photo. It was of me, standing in the gas station parking lot, the night of the attack. Written on the back, in smudged red ink, were 3 words: "We'll be back." I called the police immediately, but by the time they arrived, the envelope was gone. No one believed me. They thought I was paranoid, traumatized, seeing things that weren't there. Maybe they were right. But late at night, when the world was quiet and the shadows crept closer, I knew the truth. They weren't done with me. They were still out there, watching, waiting. And one day they'd come back to finish what they started.